Can we grow by resisting temptation? What do you think? Yeah, no, sure. And we're going to see this right here. So God does not want us to yield to temptation. So why not spare us from it? Same, it's just like we said last week. Trials aren't pleasant sometimes, are they? But again, they are. We're going. I think we said this last week. We are. I think it said we are God's scattered people, not His sheltered people. We're going to face. We're going to face trials. We're going to face temptation. So the thing is, how do we have to overcome it? And there are three things here to consider. That's going to be the bulk of our discussion today. And so the first thing that we have is when we face temptation. The first thing is God's judgment. The second thing is God's goodness. God's judgment, God's goodness. And then thirdly, God's divine nature within us. So those are the three things we're going to look at when we have to tackle temptation. God's judgment, His goodness, and His divine nature that is found, within us. And so let's look at that first one, and that's the main, I won't say the main one, but the one that's got the most on. But God's judgment. Now, when we look at God, so we're in verses 14 through 16 right here. And, God's judgment, first of all, that's where we go. That's the first one I'm going to look at. We get one of those things. It sounds negative, but it's important. We see that we need to have a good fear. When we say fear of God, does that mean being afraid of God? What does that mean when we say, hey, we need to have a good fear of God? Respect, reverence, respect, I think are all good terms. So again, when we say God's judgment, kind of the same thing right here. It sounds negative because really, we learned early in Genesis chapter 3, what's the consequence? What's the consequence from sin? Death. So that's the ultimate consequence, and I think what we're going to see right here as we kind of get into this, that, and I never thought to me, I always thought sin was just a single act. Sin is a process. It's a process. I never thought of it as a step-by-step process, and our author here kind of gets into it pretty good here. So our first step right here that we want to look at is as we go, we're going to turn the page right here to the notes. And again, we're under God's judgment right here, but the first thing that kind of leads to sin is desire. Desire. So if we look at verse 14 right here, it says, "But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed." Now, I think one thing to clear up right here, when we hear the word lust, normally we think of a certain sin, don't we? But or stuff like that. But lust is just simply a desire, as we're looking at it right here. Is the way it's defined. It's just it's a desire. It's and it's the first thing is it's an emotional, kind of the emotional part of this. And I have right there, not all desires are bad, are they? Example, is it okay for me to desire to be successful? Nothing wrong with that at all. But how I achieve that success, that's the key issue. So, or is it okay to desire, like I said, to be successful? Or if I'm a student, I desire to pass the test. But if I do that by cheating, now that's where we're having to draw a line now, aren't we? So desires, not all desires are bad. I have right there, for example, hunger and thirst are desires, is what the book would cover. Fatigue, but again, and kind of, I thought it was kind of ironic. hunger and thirst are okay, but we're not supposed to, we got to avoid gluttony, don't we? Fatigue, we're going to need to rest sometimes, but if you rest all the time, what's that? That's being lazy, isn't it? That's not good either, is it? So satisfied, the next thing right there, satisfying desires out of God's will is what gets us in trouble. And the author says desires should be, let me see, make sure I read this right. Desires should be our servants, not our masters. They should be our servants and not our masters. So that's the first one. So we go from desire. The next thing, from an emotional standpoint, now we get to the intellect stage of it. That's deception. Second step is in deception. And I think this next step, the next statement right there underneath, that's important. Temptation never shows as temptation, does it? Temptation never shows as temptation. It just appears more alluring than it is. Now I want us to look right here, as we look at verse 14 again. It says, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Now, I don't know about if y'all's Bible has that, but for example, under enticed, sometimes mine have a little symbol right there that kind of gives you a little definition right there. And it says enticed, it has trapped. And then drawn away right here, so drawn away refers to, it says that drawn away refers to baiting a trap, and enticed means baiting, it kind of refers to baiting a hook right there. Baiting a trap or baiting a hook is kind of what those are, I think the words are referenced to. Now, I don't hunt. I've fished a little bit in my lifetime, but it's, you just throw a, I don't know, sometimes when brim get on bed, sometimes you can throw an empty hook out there and they'll jump on it. They're crazy sometimes. But on a serious note, when you fish, you got to throw, you throw bait out there. What's the purpose of bait? What's that? You lure them in. So what else does the bait usually do? Besides lure you in.
Traps you on the hook.
It traps you in. Yeah, it hides the hook, don't it? It hides the hook.
Yeah.
Right? Same way, and you think about a lot of traps and stuff, things of that nature. So not only is it to entice, but it's to hide that from you right there. So temptation, it carries, basically temptation carries bait, and it's like that appeals to our desires. That's what that last statement right there. It carries the bait that appeals to our desires. So we flip it over right there. So that's kind of what I kind of summarized it right there. And as I said, the bait. That's what it is. That desires, my formatting got me right there at the end of the page. So it should be desires. So bait attracts us, but it hides the negative result. It attracts us, but it hides the negative result. And I'm not going to go back and read it. I think we're all familiar with, Matthew 4, 1 through 11 is just one of the accounts of where Jesus is tempted in the wilderness. So if you remember, when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness right there, every time Satan tempted him, what was Jesus' response? Yeah, it is written, isn't it? So I think right there, that's a big key right there of his response. It is written, or what does the Scripture say? And knowing, knowing the Word helps us. It's going to help us recognize. Jesus recognized the bait, didn't he? What were some of the things? Obviously, the first one, he'd been fasting for 40 days and he was hungry. And then, Satan says, hey, turn the stones into bread and eat. And, his response is written, man cannot live on bread alone. Then he tempts him, to test him, to fall, to bring him to have the angels catch him. And then finally, Satan tempts him with power. Hey, bow down and worship me. You can have all this. But what was always his response? It is written. And so, by knowing, when we know the Scripture, it helps us recognize the bait right there. So those are key points. I think that's a key thing there, from Jesus. So we got desire. That's the emotional. We got deception, the intellectual. So now we got to go to the third one right here, and that's disobedience. And that is will. So that's in verse 15. So it says, then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin